Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Curtain Call. Today we'll be talking about The Shape of Water. The Shape of Water is a gruesome fairy tale for adults, much like Guillermo Del Toro's other masterpiece, Pan's Labyrinth. It's set in the early 1960s, but unlike a lot of other recent media, there's nothing nostalgic about this portrayal of the past. Eliza Esposito, played by Sally Hawkins, is the Cinderella in this gritty world, playing an optimistic janitor in a dungeon-like laboratory that she and her friend Zelda, played by Octavia Spencer, have to clean of various disgusting bodily fluids. And this dungeon setting is where she must rescue her prince in a reversal of the classic trope. The world established in this film is clearly cruel to her, and yet she has beautiful, trusting relationships with the people she spends her time with. Her character is the type to make the best of any situation. Despite being mute and having the potential to be a very passive character, Eliza is anything but passive. Much like Pan's Labyrinth and very much unlike Cinderella and most other fairy tales, this main female protagonist is allowed to have a character who's more than innocent and pretty. In fact, she's feisty and defiant and never relies on her looks for anything. She also makes a lot of decisions that impact the outcome of the events in the film. If you think about most fairy tales made famous by Disney, like Cinderella, you have a female blank slate who passively and, to be fair, patiently accepts her fate without doing much of anything to affect it. Cinderella follows the abusive rules of her cruel stepfamily until a fairy godmother shows up and bibbidi-bops her to the ball, where she has no choice but to run away at midnight because of some new magically enforced rules, and then for some reason the only thing that doesn't turn back into an ugly inanimate object is her glass slipper, which, might I add, sounds incredibly uncomfortable. Also, does that mean if she removed all her clothes before midnight that she could keep them? Until finally, the prince comes to find her. Not once in the story does she affect her own fate or make an active choice. She's a model of obedience, and in opposition to most movies aimed at young boys and men, except military propaganda maybe, the message can be taken as it's better to obey orders, accept your circumstances, show no initiative, be pretty, and good things will eventually and magically just fall in your lap. Or think of Snow White and Princess Aurora, who are asleep through a majority of the action in the film and are only awake to sing some pretty fluttering songs about abstract concepts but do nothing to advance the plot with actual choices. The Little Mermaid might be the most similar to this film as a fairy tale because of the theme of nonverbal communication and fish-human interspecies relationships. Ariel also actually does make a decision in this film to trade her voice for some feet in order to get a guy to notice her because, who needs communication when you've got some rockin' legs? In The Little Mermaid, the confused message seems to fall somewhere into you can disobey your father, but his overprotectiveness is kind of justified, and when you lose your voice to a vengeful sea witch, because in Disney logic, if you're not a beautiful child, you're a jealous old hag. Luckily, it turns out your personality won't matter to a prince as long as you're hot. So in the end, nothing matters. Just kidding. Ariel is actually kind of cool without her voice because she's curious and funny and excited about the new world she enters, and they have to build a relationship more creatively than the other films over a longer period of time. Also, she does save the prince early on in the film, even though she can't explain that to him. So this isn't really the worst inspiration to draw from, although even in this case, the lesson doesn't improve much since Ariel gets everything she wanted and learns absolutely nothing from her selfish choice. However, The Shape of Water takes those basic ideas and creates a more nuanced story around it. In this version, our mermaid has always had a disadvantage in the human world as she can't communicate verbally and had no choice in the matter. And the relationship with her prince develops because of their nonverbal understanding of one another. And sidebar, it's more like a merman this time than a mermaid, and he's not exactly hot by human standards. She finds ways to communicate with people she wants to communicate with and uses her lack of verbal communication to her advantage when it's someone she doesn't want to understand her or who she wants to underestimate her. Her goal is less selfish than Ariel's because she's not defying her father just to marry some human dude she knows nothing about. Here, Eliza is defying cruel men in leadership positions because she wants to rescue someone she views as deserving of respect from being dissected. As interesting as her character and her actions in the story are, I think the villain is an even more interesting element. I've seen some reviews argue that he's one of the weakest parts of the movie. By weak, I don't think they mean to imply that Michael Shannon, the actor, is weak in the role, because he's really incredible as a villain. But the movie does present his character, Strickland, in a fairly black and white manner. As far as fairy tales go, this isn't unusual. Most of the time, they have a very simplistic good versus evil theme. However, you can see how an adult might feel a little infantilized when there isn't more complexity to the villainous character. This is actually very similar to the way the villain is presented in Pan's Labyrinth. In Pan's Labyrinth, the villain is a criticism of extreme fascist masculinity, while in The Shape of Water, the villain serves as a criticism of the kind of 50s idealized masculinity. Michael Shannon's character represents the kind of masculinity that seeks to dominate everyone around him, socially, physically, and even sexually. We do get glimpses to show that he's a product of his environment, though, especially when his superior comes and the men engage in a figurative manhood comparison competition, basically. Once he makes a mistake, his superior makes him feel like a full-on failure and like less of a man. Despite that, he is what would have been considered the ideal man in the 50s and the early 60s, with his suburban house, gorgeous wife, 2.5 kids, and a brand new Cadillac, and gelatin parfait. I feel like the parfait serves as a kind of metaphor for the false perfection of his life. They're the advertisement that Giles, Eliza's neighbor, is trying to paint of gelatin parfait. However, the way he's framed from the very beginning makes it obvious from a modern perspective that he's going to be the straightforward villain. He's depraved, racist, and disrespectful throughout the film. It's not subtle at all. But I can't say that really ruined him as a villain for me, because I enjoyed the juxtaposition between the appearance of his life and how he actually behaves on a day-to-day basis. His undoing is underestimating those he believes he dominates by virtue of his gender and position, which might be simplistic but works in the context of the film. Another character worth discussing is Eliza's friend Giles, played by Richard Jenkins, a queer older man who, as I thought about it more, is actually the most tragic character in the film, despite his framing. Every scene he's in is actually pretty depressing, but the movie's tone seems to be saying, he's fine, see look, he's a good guy, so he'll be fine. I didn't even notice this until after I left the theater. That's how differently the tone represents him versus the scenes themselves. Octavia Spencer's character, Zelda, is complicated to discuss because she has to deal with the most verbal abuse directed at both her and Eliza throughout the film and has to respond to it patiently and respectfully.
Do you know what an affront is?
Something offensive?
That's right.
She's the most loyal, intuitive, and supportive person in the film, and yet her character only really gets to use these traits in relation to Eliza. She does get some of the best lines, though. My favorite being the one while they're cleaning the men's bathroom where she says something like, "You'd think with all the smartest minds in the world, they'd know how to aim at the toilet." If you're familiar with Guillermo Del Toro's last film, Crimson Peak, you can see how this is an evolution of that style. That movie was marketed very much as a horror film, but ended up being a kind of ghost story mixed with a love story mixed with a mystery. It was really beautiful, like this one, but the tone was all over the place, and despite all those elements, was actually pretty boring. This movie got right what that movie got wrong. This is still a horror-inspired love story, but this time there's a much greater focus on a coherent story and building the characters. We have characters who are enjoyable to watch this time, who we're rooting for and become emotionally invested in. I was on the edge of my seat the entire film because I cared so much about the main characters. One thing I can say is if you're not okay with gruesome imagery, you're probably going to hate this film. If you were okay with the gruesome imagery in Pan's Labyrinth, you'll probably be okay with this one, but it feels much more out of place this time considering this one has a much lighter tone and themes of love and acceptance rather than childhood escapism from cruel fascist realities. The design of the creature, played by Doug Jones, a Del Toro favorite, is absolutely amazing and totally evokes the creature from the Black Lagoon like they were going for. His character in the film is really interesting too. Some people see him as a god, others see him as a monster, Eliza sees him as vulnerable and lonely, and the audience is able to see that all of these assessments are true in some way. The movie has the kind of Hunchback of Notre Dame thing going on, where the question of what makes a man and what makes a monster is emphasized by the dichotomy between his character and Michael Shannon's character. This then gets externalized through some rotting fingers. I'll leave it at that. There are genuinely funny moments in the film, and genuinely heartwarming ones too. As I mentioned earlier, if you're squeamish, you may want to skip this one, or just think about how incredible and artistic the practical effects they use to make the gruesome imagery are. There is so much to like about this film, even if you can't stand some parts. The sets, the dialogue, the cinematic language, the artistry, the symbolism, the characters, the actors, and the fairy tale framing all make it such an unusual and fun film. My complaints are minimal, and even the ending, which I wasn't completely sold on, still felt fitting. All in all, this has been the most enjoyable movie-going experience and my favorite overall movie of 2018 so far. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode of Curtain Call.